The strongest people are usually the ones nobody notices until it is too late. The old correctional officer muttered as he watched the transport bus roll through the steel gates of Greystone State Prison. But nobody around him paid attention, because every eye was fixed on the new arrivals stepping onto the cracked pavement beneath the afternoon sun. Among them was a quiet African-American man with short gray hair and a tired canvas bag slung over one shoulder. He looked older than most of the inmates, somewhere close to 60, and he moved with the calm, steady pace of someone who had stopped trying to impress the world many years ago. His prison paperwork identified him as Marcus Reed, but names rarely mattered inside Greystone. People were judged by appearance, reputation, and the fear they could create. Marcus did not seem to have any of those things. He kept his eyes forward, answered every instruction politely, and quietly took his place in line while the other new inmates whispered to one another. Several of them looked nervous. One looked angry. But Marcus simply looked peaceful, almost as though the heavy walls and razor wires surrounding him had no power over his thoughts. Across the yard, another group of inmates stood watching the arrivals. At the center of them was Brandon Cole, a tall, white inmate known throughout the prison as the man nobody wanted to challenge. He had spent years building a reputation through intimidation and arrogance, and every newcomer eventually became another opportunity to remind the block who was in charge. Brandon folded his arms and slowly scanned the line until his eyes stopped on Marcus. The old man looked nothing like the dangerous men who usually earned respect inside prison. His posture was relaxed, his shoulders were straight, and there was something unusual about the way he stood, balanced and completely still. But Brandon only saw gray hair and silence. One of his friends laughed and pointed toward Marcus. "That old guy looks like he got lost on the way to a retirement home." A few others laughed with him. But Marcus never turned his head. He simply continued walking with the line toward intake processing. Officer Walter Hayes watched the exchange from the security platform above. His eyes stayed on Marcus a little longer than necessary. There was something familiar about the old inmate, something buried deep in his memory that he could not quite reach, but before he could think about it any longer. Another officer called his name, and the moment passed. After fingerprinting and paperwork, the new inmates were escorted toward the main housing block. The massive doors slid open with a metallic sound that echoed through the corridor. Conversation stopped as the older prisoner entered the building. Dozens of eyes followed him, measuring him, judging him, deciding where he belonged in the invisible order of the prison. Marcus accepted a folded blanket and a small package of supplies from the intake officer and quietly thanked him. The simple act surprised a few people nearby, because politeness was rare inside Greystone. Brandon had already reached the cafeteria with his group. Waiting for the new arrivals to come through, he leaned against a table with an amused smile, determined to make an example of someone before dinner was over. When Marcus finally stepped inside carrying his tray, the room seemed to grow strangely quiet. He looked around once, found an empty seat near the corner, and slowly walked toward it without bothering anyone. Brandon stepped into his path. Several inmates immediately looked up from their meals, expecting the usual display of dominance that happened every time a new prisoner arrived. Brandon looked Marcus up and down before speaking loudly enough for the entire room to hear. "You picked the wrong place to act calm, old man." Marcus looked at him with quiet eyes and simply answered, "I am only looking for a place to eat." The answer was so simple that a few inmates laughed, but Brandon did not. He took one step closer, stared directly at the older man, and with a look of complete disrespect spat onto the front of Marcus's prison shirt. The cafeteria froze, trays stopped moving, conversations disappeared. Everyone waited to see what the quiet black inmate would do. Marcus slowly looked down at the stain, reached into his pocket, unfolded a small handkerchief, and calmly wiped it away without saying a single word. Then he picked up his tray and walked to the empty table, leaving Brandon standing alone in the middle of the room while dozens of inmates stared in confusion, because nobody could understand how a man could be humiliated in front of an entire prison and still carry himself with the dignity of someone who had absolutely nothing to prove. And high above the cafeteria floor, Officer Walter Hayes continued watching the silent old inmate, feeling that strange sense of recognition return. As though somewhere in the distant past he had seen that same unshaken look in the eyes of a man who had once stood in places far more dangerous than Greystone State Prison. There are two kinds of strength in this world, the kind that demands attention and the kind that never needs to. Officer Walter Hayes quietly thought as he continued watching the older inmate from the security platform above the cafeteria. The room slowly came back to life after the strange moment that had left everyone confused. Trays scraped across tables. Conversations returned, and nervous laughter echoed through the building. But something had changed. Brandon Cole stood in the middle of the aisle expecting applause or approval from the other inmates. Yet most of them simply looked toward the corner where Marcus Reed had calmly taken his seat and started eating his meal as though nothing unusual had happened. The older man unfolded his napkin, adjusted his tray, and quietly thanked another inmate who accidentally bumped his chair while walking past. Brandon frowned because that was not the reaction he had expected. Usually a new prisoner would become angry, scared, or desperate to defend his pride. But Marcus had done none of those things. One of Brandon's friends leaned closer and laughed. "I think you broke him." Brandon forced a smile, but somewhere deep inside he felt strangely unsettled, because the quiet black inmate had looked directly at him. Without the slightest hint of fear, across the room a younger prisoner named Ethan Walker watched everything carefully. He had only been inside Greystone for 6 months and had learned to stay away from trouble, but there was something about Marcus that caught his attention. After dinner, Ethan saw the older man carry his empty tray toward the return station. Another inmate accidentally dropped a cup onto the floor, spilling water across the walkway. Marcus stopped immediately, picked up the cup, handed it back with a polite smile, and quietly helped wipe the floor dry before anyone could slip. The younger inmate thanked him, and Marcus simply nodded before continuing on his way. Ethan looked around and noticed several prisoners staring at the scene, confused by the old man's kindness, because simple decency was not something people expected to find inside prison walls. Meanwhile, Officer Hayes walked down from the platform and crossed paths with Marcus near the hallway leading toward the housing units. For just a second, the old officer stopped walking and looked directly into Marcus's eyes. The strange feeling returned again, as though he had met this man somewhere long ago. Marcus gave a respectful nod and quietly stepped aside to let the officer pass first. Hayes returned the nod almost automatically before continuing down the corridor, but his thoughts stayed with the silent inmate. Later that evening, the prisoners were escorted back to their cells. Brandon sat on the lower bunk inside his cell block staring at the concrete floor. One of his friends joked about the old man again, but Brandon barely listened. He remembered the way Marcus had simply wiped his shirt clean and walked away. There had been no anger, no humiliation, and no weakness, only complete control. He had seen fighters lose their tempers over far less. Yet somehow the old prisoner had acted as though the insult meant absolutely nothing. Ethan found himself assigned to the same housing section as Marcus. Their cells were only a short distance apart. As the evening count finished, Ethan noticed the older man carefully folding his blanket with perfect edges, placing his shoes neatly beneath the bed, and organizing every small item inside the cell with almost unbelievable precision. It did not look like an ordinary habit. It looked practiced, almost professional. Ethan quietly asked, "Did you serve in the military or something?" Marcus looked up for a moment, a faint smile crossing his face, then answered softly, "A long time ago I learned that discipline makes difficult places easier to survive." Before Ethan could ask another question, the lights dimmed, signaling the end of the day. The younger inmate lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the strange events in his mind. While across the block, Brandon also found himself unable to sleep, wondering why a quiet old prisoner had managed to shake his confidence without raising a voice or lifting a hand. And standing at the far end of the corridor during his nightly patrol, Officer Walter Hayes glanced once more toward Marcus Reed's cell, feeling certain that one day very soon he was going to remember exactly where he had seen that calm, unshakable face before. Marcus Reed woke up to the sound of clanging metal and the echo of footsteps through the long, narrow corridor. The morning light filtered in through the high windows, casting a faint glow across the concrete walls. He quietly rose from his bunk and adjusted his uniform with precise movements, making sure every crease and fold was exact. Down the hall, new prisoners were being led into the day room, voices low and uncertain. Marcus observed from his cell doorway, noting the nervous glances and hesitant steps. He understood that fear and respect were often intertwined. The janitor, a wiry man named Lewis Grant, moved quietly between the cells, sweeping the floor and carrying out routine tasks. He noticed Marcus's calm demeanor and gave a subtle nod, recognizing discipline and experience in the older inmate. Meanwhile, a group of younger prisoners huddled together near the opposite wall, whispering and laughing softly at what they assumed would be an easy target. Brandon Cole leaned against the railing, eyeing Marcus with a smirk, ready to assert dominance with his typical bravado. The room seemed to hold its breath as Marcus calmly stepped forward, never raising his voice, his presence alone creating an unspoken boundary. Brandon made a move to test him, tossing a small piece of debris in Marcus's direction. The older man barely glanced at it and continued his measured walk toward the dining area. The younger prisoners were puzzled by his lack of reaction. Ethan Walker, still observing from the corner, felt a sense of intrigue. He noticed the subtle confidence in Marcus's posture. The way he carried himself suggested experience far beyond prison walls. During breakfast, Marcus kept to his routine, organizing his tray and utensils with methodical care. He offered polite gestures to those who bumped into him, and his quiet efficiency commanded attention without a word. Brandon's frustration grew as he realized that Marcus's composure was not a weakness but a controlled strength. He whispered to his friends, trying to regain a sense of authority. Marcus looked up briefly, catching Brandon's eye, and gave a faint nod, a simple gesture that conveyed awareness and restraint. The effect was immediate. The group faltered, unsure how to proceed. As the day progressed, Marcus moved through the yard with careful observation, noting the interactions among prisoners, maintaining a presence that was calm yet commanding. He helped another inmate pick up a dropped item without fanfare, and his composed actions quietly taught lessons of respect and patience. Ethan followed, curious and attentive, trying to learn from Marcus's disciplined approach. By mid-afternoon, rumors began to spread among the inmates. Tales of the quiet black inmate who had defused tension with nothing more than his calm demeanor and precise actions. The janitor, Lewis, observed with quiet approval, aware that Marcus's reputation was slowly growing. Marcus continued his routine, each action deliberate, each glance measured. He understood the importance of setting a tone of respect and self-control, even among those accustomed to challenging authority. As evening approached, the prisoners were returned to their cells. Marcus methodically folded his blankets, arranged his personal items, and prepared for the night. Brandon Cole lay on his bunk, silently reflecting on the day, unsettled by the subtle power Marcus had demonstrated without confrontation. Ethan Walker watched from across the hall, inspired by the older inmate's unshakable calm and discipline. As the lights dimmed and the block settled into quiet, the aura of Marcus Reed lingered, a reminder that true strength often spoke in silence, and that the quiet black inmate had already begun to change the dynamics within the cell block with nothing more than his presence and disciplined approach. The night air carried a sense of anticipation, as both friends and observers wondered how the days ahead would unfold, with Marcus quietly influencing those around him. The fourth morning inside Greystone State Prison arrived with the same cold routine that greeted every inmate. Steel doors opened, boots echoed through the corridors, and men lined up for breakfast beneath the watchful eyes of the correctional officers. But for Ethan Walker, the routine no longer felt ordinary because his attention kept drifting toward Marcus Reed, the quiet older inmate who had somehow become the center of countless unanswered questions. Marcus stepped out of his cell with his blanket folded into a perfect square and his few personal belongings arranged with such careful precision that Ethan could not help noticing. He had seen military documentaries before, and something about the older man's habits felt strangely familiar. Marcus walked calmly through the hallway without rushing, never bumping into anyone, never looking nervous, and somehow always seeming aware of everything around him. Ethan hurried to catch up and quietly asked, "How do you always stay so calm in a place like this?" Marcus looked at him for a moment before answering. "You cannot always choose your surroundings, but you can choose how you carry yourself inside them." The words were simple, but Ethan found himself thinking about them long after breakfast ended. Later that morning, several inmates were assigned maintenance duties. Around the recreation yard, Marcus was given the task of organizing old storage shelves near the equipment room. Ethan volunteered to help simply because he wanted to spend more time around the older inmate. While moving dusty boxes from one side of the room to the other, Ethan noticed something unusual. Marcus never struggled to balance awkward objects. Every movement seemed efficient, every step measured, as though he had repeated similar tasks thousands of times before. One heavy container began slipping from the top shelf. Ethan instinctively reached for it. But before he could react, Marcus calmly extended one hand and steadied the box with almost effortless timing. There was nothing dramatic about it. Yet Ethan stood frozen because the older man had moved with incredible precision without appearing rushed. Marcus simply placed the container safely on the floor and continued working, pretending nothing unusual had happened. Ethan looked at him with growing curiosity. "How did you do that?" Marcus smiled faintly and replied, "When you pay attention, you usually arrive before problems do." Across the yard, Brandon Cole watched the scene from a distance. One of his friends laughed and said, "That old guy has you thinking too much." Brandon shrugged, trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling that had been following him since the cafeteria. He had expected Marcus to break, to become angry or afraid. But instead, the older inmate seemed completely unaffected by everything happening around him. Brandon could not explain why that bothered him so much. Meanwhile, Officer Walter Hayes walked past the storage room during his morning inspection. He slowed down when he noticed Marcus arranging supplies. The shelves looked almost identical, every box lined up with exact spacing, labels facing outward, tools sorted by size and purpose. Hayes stopped for a second because the arrangement reminded him of an old military supply depot he had visited decades earlier. The memory flashed across his mind and disappeared before he could fully grasp it. Marcus noticed the officer standing there and politely nodded. Hayes returned the gesture and quietly continued walking, his thoughts becoming heavier with every passing day. After lunch, the inmates gathered in the yard for recreation time. Ethan sat beside Marcus on a wooden bench while several others played basketball nearby. One careless pass sent the ball rolling directly toward them. Without even looking up, Marcus calmly reached out with his foot and stopped it perfectly before it reached the fence. Then he picked it up and tossed it back with an easy motion. The younger inmates thanked him and returned to their game. Ethan stared in disbelief because the older man had reacted almost before anyone else noticed the ball moving. Marcus simply folded his hands together and looked toward the afternoon sky. "Little things become easier when you stay focused," he said quietly. Ethan nodded, but inside his mind another question had already formed. Because every hour spent around Marcus Reed seemed to reveal another piece of a story that nobody else inside Greystone State Prison appeared to know. And from across the yard, Officer Walter Hayes watched the quiet black inmate once again, feeling more certain than ever that somewhere in the distant past he had seen those same calm movements from a man wearing a very different uniform. The afternoon sun filtered through the narrow windows of Greystone State Prison, casting long shadows across the recreation yard where Marcus Reed moved with an almost imperceptible grace. Ethan Walker followed closely behind, carrying a stack of freshly cleaned equipment bags. As they made their way toward the storage shed, the air was filled with the low murmur of conversations and the occasional clatter of metal tools being arranged. Yet Marcus remained composed, every step deliberate and measured, his posture upright and eyes scanning the environment with quiet attentiveness. Ethan could not help but notice how other inmates seemed to unconsciously give him space, as if they sensed a presence that commanded respect without a word. A few younger inmates tried to catch his attention with playful banter, but Marcus simply nodded politely and continued his work, demonstrating patience and precision as he methodically stacked and sorted items by size and type. A small group of new arrivals watched from the side, curious and somewhat intimidated by the calm authority he projected. Ethan observed Marcus taking a moment to inspect a toolbox, his fingers running along the edges and adjusting the contents with careful consideration. It was clear that every movement was intentional, born from experience and discipline. Across the yard, Brandon Cole and his crew noticed the older inmate's meticulous approach. Brandon whispered to a friend, "He is not like the rest. There is something different about him." And though he tried to dismiss the feeling, he could not shake the sense of unease. Marcus noticed Ethan struggling with a heavy bag and stepped in silently, offering a guiding hand to help balance it as they moved. The assistance was gentle but firm, demonstrating skill without drawing attention. Ethan realized that Marcus's calm demeanor and precise movements could influence the behavior of others around him, and this subtle control seemed to radiate naturally from his presence. Later, during a brief break, Marcus and Ethan sat on a bench near the far fence, sipping water and observing the yard. The chatter of other inmates filled the space. Yet Marcus remained unaffected, scanning for any signs of disruption or tension and offering occasional advice in a quiet voice. Watch the flow, anticipate the next step, and you will find the moments where control is yours. Ethan nodded, absorbing every word. The rhythm of the yard seemed to slow in his perception as he watched Marcus interact with the environment, from guiding misplaced equipment to quietly redirecting a wandering inmate without confrontation. Even the correctional officers seemed to notice the older inmate's composed presence. Officer Walter Hayes passing by gave a slight nod of acknowledgment, perhaps recognizing the efficiency and awareness Marcus displayed. Back in the storage area, Marcus took an old broom and used it to sweep the floor with precise, fluid motions. Ethan realized that each action he performed was economical and deliberate, nothing wasted, and even the mundane task of cleaning became a demonstration of skill and calm authority. As the day wore on, Marcus guided Ethan through organizing the shed, showing subtle techniques that emphasized observation and anticipation. From aligning the tools at perfect angles to stacking boxes without strain, Ethan began to understand that the older inmate's capabilities extended far beyond mere physical skill. It was his ability to read situations, maintain composure, and act with efficiency that set him apart. As the shift ended and the inmates returned the equipment to their proper places, a sense of order and quiet accomplishment settled over the area. The younger inmates who had doubted Marcus earlier were left with an unspoken recognition of his unique presence. Ethan looked at him with a mix of awe and curiosity, silently noting that he had learned more about discipline, awareness, and control in a single afternoon than in weeks elsewhere. Marcus Reed remained calm, methodical, and quietly influential, embodying a mastery of both skill and demeanor that could not be taught easily. Leaving Ethan to contemplate the lessons he had witnessed in the subtle command of actions and presence, the yard continued to hum with activity. But Marcus's example lingered in Ethan's mind, a blueprint for patience, observation, and purposeful action that would shape the way he approached the remaining days within the walls of Greystone State Prison. The morning sunlight filtered softly through the high windows of Greystone State Prison, casting pale stripes across the yard where Marcus Reed moved with careful precision, his calm presence immediately noticeable among the crowd of inmates who carried out their morning routines. Ethan Walker followed closely, carrying a folded laundry basket, silently observing how Marcus approached even the simplest tasks with careful planning and deliberate movements. Every step seemed measured, his posture upright and alert, yet entirely relaxed, as Marcus guided Ethan to organize the benches along the walkway, explaining the importance of spacing and order in maintaining a functional environment without raising his voice. A few inmates glanced curiously at the older man, whispering among themselves about his unusual composure and the quiet authority he seemed to project without effort. Marcus paused briefly to adjust a bench, his hands steady and movements precise. Ethan noticed that other inmates automatically gave space around Marcus, sensing the unspoken confidence he exuded. The yard supervisor, Officer Hayes, passed by, nodding slightly as if acknowledging Marcus's organized approach and calm demeanor. Marcus continued to instruct Ethan on the arrangement of supplies, demonstrating methods that minimized effort while maintaining efficiency, from stacking chairs to lining up brooms and mops, each motion purposeful and fluid. Ethan found himself learning more about awareness and discipline in these practical demonstrations than he had in weeks elsewhere. During a break, Marcus and Ethan sat on the edge of the yard, water bottles in hand, quietly observing the flow of activity. Marcus spoke softly, pointing out subtle patterns in inmate behavior, noting where small adjustments could prevent disruption or confusion. His words were precise, practical, and easily applicable. The younger inmates, initially skeptical, began to mimic some of Marcus's movements, arranging their tools and belongings more carefully, influenced by the calm example he set. As the morning wore on, Marcus moved through the yard, quietly redirecting misplaced items, lending a hand without making a show, his efficiency and discretion notable. Even the usually boisterous group, led by Brandon Cole, seemed momentarily restrained by the older inmate's composed presence. Ethan marveled at the quiet authority Marcus held. Realizing that true control did not require aggression but observation, patience, and well-timed intervention, Marcus demonstrated how to lift and move heavy supplies with minimal strain, instructing Ethan on posture, leverage, and anticipation, making the task look effortless, while reinforcing principles of mindfulness and control throughout the morning. Marcus's consistent focus and deliberate actions influenced the environment subtly but undeniably, creating an atmosphere where organization, respect, and calm prevailed. As the yard activities concluded and the inmates returned to their cells or routines, Ethan reflected on the lessons from Marcus, recognizing that the older inmate's skill extended beyond physical coordination into the realm of strategic awareness and psychological influence. A mastery of presence and observation that quietly shaped the behavior of those around him. The sun climbed higher, yet Marcus continued his tasks with unwavering composure, leaving a lasting impression on Ethan and others who observed him, an embodiment of quiet strength, discipline, and effective leadership that could guide actions without confrontation, teaching through demonstration rather than words. The yard remained lively but orderly, a testament to the subtle power of attentiveness, presence, and purposeful action in the hands of someone who understood both the physical and social dynamics at play. Another sunrise arrived behind the gray walls of Greystone State Prison, and by now almost everyone in the housing block had noticed that Marcus Reed was unlike any inmate they had ever met. He never argued over small things, never rushed through the chow line, and never seemed disturbed by the endless noise that filled the corridors. While most men carried tension on their faces, Marcus carried quiet focus, and that difference had slowly become impossible to ignore. Ethan Walker continued, spending every free moment near the older inmate, helping him organize supplies after work assignments, and listening carefully whenever Marcus shared one of his simple observations about discipline or patience. Those lessons never sounded like speeches, they sounded like truths learned through a lifetime of experience. One morning as they returned from breakfast, Ethan asked, "Do you ever get angry?" Marcus looked ahead as they walked and answered softly, "Everyone feels anger. The important part is deciding whether it controls you or teaches you." The words stayed with Ethan long after they reached the recreation yard. Across the block, Brandon Cole watched the conversation with growing frustration. He had expected the old inmate to disappear into the background after their first encounter, but instead more people seemed drawn toward him every day. Even inmates who usually avoided trouble would quietly greet Marcus with a nod, and the older man always returned the gesture with the same calm expression. Brandon gathered a few members of his group near the basketball court and laughed loudly enough for others to hear. "Looks like the old man is building himself a fan club." Several inmates forced small laughs, but many simply stayed silent. Brandon noticed that silence, and it bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Later that afternoon, work crews were assigned to clean storage rooms near the gymnasium. Marcus and Ethan were once again paired together. While moving old equipment, Ethan discovered a dusty wooden crate pushed against the far wall. He tried to pull it free, but it would not move. Marcus walked over, studied the position of the crate for a second, then quietly adjusted its angle and guided Ethan where to stand. Together they slid it out smoothly without strain. Ethan smiled and said, "You always know the easiest way." Marcus simply replied, "There is usually a better solution if you stop rushing." Inside the crate were old sports supplies and several forgotten magazines that had been stored years before. Ethan picked one up and started brushing dust from the cover. But before he could open it, Officer Walter Hayes entered the room for a routine inspection. His eyes immediately stopped on Marcus, then drifted toward the old stack of magazines. Something about the scene seemed to trigger another distant memory. Hayes frowned slightly, trying to remember where he had once seen a man organize equipment with that same level of precision. Marcus politely stepped aside to let the officer examine the storage area. Hayes nodded absent-mindedly before leaving, his thoughts heavier than ever. After the work detail ended, the inmates gathered in the yard. Brandon decided he had seen enough of the quiet respect surrounding Marcus. He walked across the open space with several members of his group following behind him. Conversation slowly faded as people noticed where he was going. Ethan looked nervous, but Marcus remained seated on the bench watching the afternoon clouds drift across the sky. Brandon stopped directly in front of him and folded his arms. "You really think staying quiet makes you better than everyone else?" he asked loudly. Marcus looked up calmly and answered, "No. I think listening helps you understand people." A few inmates exchanged surprised glances because nobody had ever answered Brandon that way. There was no fear in Marcus's voice and no challenge either. Only simple honesty. Brandon waited for an argument that never came. Finally, he shook his head and walked away with his group, pretending the conversation meant nothing. But Ethan noticed the expression on Brandon's face. For the first time, the toughest man in Greystone looked uncertain. As evening count approached, Ethan helped Marcus return the cleaning tools to the storage room. While placing the last box on the shelf, he glanced at the dusty magazines again. One corner of a cover had become visible beneath the others, and for just a second, he thought he saw the photograph of a younger soldier standing proudly in a military uniform that looked strangely familiar. Before he could reach for it, the lights dimmed, and the officer ordered everyone back to their cells, leaving Ethan awake that night with one question repeating in his mind. Why did the man in that old picture look so much like Marcus Reed? The next afternoon, the work crews returned to the old storage building beside the prison library. And although most of the inmates complained about cleaning dusty shelves and moving forgotten boxes, Ethan Walker could think about only one thing: the photograph he thought he had seen hidden inside the stack of old magazines. All morning the image had stayed in his mind. A younger man wearing a military uniform with the same calm eyes and steady expression as Marcus Reed, while the other inmates joked and talked. Ethan quietly hurried through his assigned tasks, hoping for another chance to look through the forgotten collection. Marcus worked beside him with the same patience he showed every day, carefully arranging supplies and repairing damaged shelves without ever rushing. At one point, Ethan accidentally dropped a small container of screws across the floor. Several inmates laughed, expecting the older man to become annoyed. But Marcus simply knelt down and began gathering the scattered pieces one by one. "When something falls apart," he said quietly, "you do not waste time blaming it. You simply put it back together." Ethan smiled and joined him, realizing that every lesson Marcus shared somehow reached beyond the simple task in front of them. Across the room, Officer Walter Hayes completed his routine inspection, but before leaving he paused and looked once more toward Marcus. The older inmate was organizing tools with the same perfect order that had been troubling the officer's memory for days. Every item was placed exactly where it belonged, every movement smooth and efficient. Hayes slowly walked away, rubbing his forehead as though trying to force an old memory back to the surface. After lunch, the work detail continued, and while Marcus helped another inmate repair a damaged storage rack, Ethan quietly walked over to the stack of magazines pushed against the wall. He carefully lifted the top few issues until the old cover he had noticed the night before became visible. Dust covered most of the page, but after wiping it away with his sleeve, he could finally see the photograph clearly. It showed a younger African-American soldier standing with several other service members, all wearing military uniforms. At the center of the picture, the younger man's posture was perfectly straight, his expression calm and focused, and beneath the photograph, a headline read, "Elite Army Ranger Training Program produces nation's finest instructors." Ethan felt his heart begin to race because the face in the picture looked exactly like Marcus Reed, only younger. He quickly looked around to make sure nobody else had noticed, then read the small caption beneath the image. The print had faded with time, but one name was still clear enough to recognize: Marcus Reed. Ethan stared at the page in disbelief, trying to understand how the quiet inmate who spent his days cleaning storage rooms and helping strangers could possibly have once been one of the country's elite military instructors. Footsteps approached behind him, and he quickly closed the magazine, turning to see Officer Hayes entering the room again. The older officer noticed the dusty publication in Ethan's hands and asked, "What did you find?" Ethan hesitated for a second before opening the magazine and silently pointing toward the photograph. Hayes adjusted his glasses and looked down at the page. The moment his eyes reached the younger soldier, his entire expression changed. The old memory he had been chasing suddenly returned. Years earlier, before joining the correctional service, Walter Hayes had attended a joint emergency response training exercise, and the man leading one of the demonstrations had been in Army Ranger instructor with the exact same calm eyes and quiet voice. Hayes looked across the room toward Marcus, who was helping another inmate lift a wooden shelf into place. The older inmate never looked up, completely unaware that his secret had just begun to surface. Ethan whispered, "That is him, is it not?" Hayes remained silent for several long seconds before finally answering in a voice barely above a whisper. "I think that man trained some of the best soldiers this country ever had." Ethan slowly looked back at the photograph, then toward Marcus Reed. And for the first time since arriving at Greystone State Prison, he realized that the quiet black inmate everyone had underestimated might be carrying a past far greater than anyone inside those walls could possibly imagine. The next morning, Greystone State Prison felt unusually quiet as Ethan Walker arrived at the cafeteria for breakfast. The usual chatter among the inmates was subdued, and all eyes seemed to shift toward Marcus Reed, who quietly moved through the line carrying his tray with calm precision. Ethan noticed the subtle tension radiating from some of the younger inmates, whispering to one another, their glances fixed on Marcus as if trying to measure him. The very air seemed charged with a mixture of curiosity and unspoken respect. As Marcus reached the table where he usually sat, the gang leader, Todd Simmons, a tall white inmate known for his loud demeanor, glanced at him with a smirk, nudging a few of his companions and whispering something that made them all chuckle. Ethan felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach, wondering if this was the moment where Marcus's past would collide with the present. As the lunch period progressed, Todd and his group of inmates began teasing a smaller, quieter inmate near the drink station. One of them deliberately spilled a small cup of juice close to the edge of Marcus's table, pretending it was an accident. Marcus merely adjusted his tray slightly to avoid the spill, showing no reaction to the provocation. His calm demeanor only seemed to frustrate the gang members more. Todd decided to escalate, reaching for a bread roll and tossing it gently toward Marcus in an attempt to provoke a response. Marcus caught it effortlessly and placed it neatly on his tray without a word. The other inmates at the table began murmuring among themselves, clearly impressed by Marcus's composure. Ethan quietly observed the interaction, recognizing the subtle power dynamics at play. Marcus's presence alone seemed to command attention and restraint. Suddenly Todd leaned closer and said something in a low voice meant only for Marcus to hear, a taunting comment about his quiet nature and supposed weakness. The older inmate looked up, his eyes locking with Todd's, and for a moment, the cafeteria seemed to hold its breath. Marcus tilted his head slightly and spoke, his voice calm, yet carrying an authority that was unmistakable. He mentioned a past training exercise and the importance of discipline. Todd's smirk faltered as he realized Marcus was referencing a level of expertise and experience far beyond anything he could comprehend. A hush fell over the nearby tables as other inmates turned to watch. The realization of Marcus's elite background slowly began to settle among them. Ethan felt a surge of admiration, seeing how Marcus could convey authority and respect without raising his voice or showing aggression. The cafeteria staff moved along the line efficiently, and Marcus finished his meal quietly, cleaning up his tray and helping another inmate pick up a fallen napkin. Todd and his friends exchanged glances, unsure of how to react to a man whose reputation seemed to precede him. The subtle shift in the room was palpable, as whispers circulated about Marcus's past, suggesting he had once been part of an elite Army Ranger unit. Ethan noted how the other inmates now approached him with a mix of curiosity and cautious respect, and as the lunch period ended, Marcus rose, nodding politely to Ethan before heading toward the work detail. The quiet strength and unassuming discipline he displayed left a lasting impression on everyone present, and even Todd appeared momentarily unsettled, realizing that underestimating the quiet black inmate could be a mistake no one in the cafeteria would soon forget. As the lunchroom slowly emptied, Ethan followed Marcus, eager to learn more about the man whose calm authority had turned the cafeteria atmosphere into one of reverence and quiet acknowledgment. Every step Marcus took reinforced the idea that experience, patience, and unwavering composure could command respect far more effectively than noise or intimidation ever could. Ethan Walker could feel the tension building as Marcus Reed led him through the narrow corridors of Greystone State Prison, each step echoing against the cold concrete walls. The familiar sounds of clanging metal doors and distant chatter creating a background rhythm that seemed almost hypnotic. The other inmates watched cautiously from a distance, some nodding subtly in acknowledgment of Marcus's presence. Todd Simmons and his usual group lingered near the recreation yard, casting sideways glances, unsure whether to provoke him or retreat. Ethan sensed the subtle shift in the power dynamics. Marcus's calm composure and authoritative posture conveyed confidence without a single raised voice. As they approached the work detail area, Marcus began assigning tasks with methodical precision, his instructions clear and concise, yet commanding attention. Even from those who were initially skeptical, Todd tried to interject with a sarcastic remark about Marcus's calm nature, but the seasoned inmate ignored it, focusing on the tasks at hand while demonstrating an effortless efficiency that drew admiration from onlookers. A few younger inmates whispered among themselves, realizing that underestimating Marcus could be a costly mistake. Ethan observed how Marcus handled minor disputes with tact and fairness, diffusing tension before it could escalate. The respect he earned seemed to stem from his ability to maintain order and dignity, not from intimidation. As the day progressed, Marcus led a group through routine maintenance work, showing patience and subtle guidance. The other inmates began to mimic his disciplined approach, quietly adjusting their own behaviors. Todd's smirk faded as he noticed the shift, understanding that Marcus's influence extended far beyond mere physical presence. During a break, Marcus sat with Ethan and discussed the importance of focus and resilience. Using examples from his elite Army Ranger training, Ethan was captivated, recognizing that Marcus's past experiences informed his current calm authority. The lunch bell rang, and the group moved to the cafeteria, Marcus walking in with measured steps, all eyes naturally turning toward him. Todd hesitated at the entrance, unsure whether to confront or observe. Marcus chose the latter, guiding Ethan to a table and encouraging others to sit respectfully around them. The gang leader's usual bravado diminished as the room collectively acknowledged Marcus's composed dominance. Whispers circulated about his elite background. The quiet black inmate who had been underestimated by so many was now a figure commanding respect and subtle influence over the daily rhythm of prison life. As the day drew to a close, Ethan reflected on the lessons learned, noting that true authority did not require aggression, but rather a combination of skill, patience, and unwavering composure. Marcus's presence had subtly transformed the environment, creating a sense of order and mutual respect that had been lacking before, and even Todd seemed to reconsider his approach, understanding that underestimating a disciplined, experienced individual could be a mistake that altered the balance of power within the prison walls. The following morning brought an unusual feeling to Greystone State Prison, because rumors had begun moving through the housing blocks faster than the correctional officers could stop them. Whispers about the quiet older inmate, who had once trained some of the finest soldiers in the country, reached almost every corner of the facility. But Marcus Reed acted as though he had heard nothing at all. He woke before the morning count, folded his blanket with the same careful precision, straightened the few belongings inside his cell, and quietly waited for the doors to open. Ethan Walker watched from across the corridor and realized that not even the growing attention around him had changed the older man. Marcus still greeted everyone with a respectful nod, still thanked the officers when they handed out breakfast trays, and still carried himself with the calm discipline that had first caught Ethan's attention. During the morning work assignment, the inmates were sent to organize the old maintenance building near the library. Several younger prisoners gathered around Marcus asking small questions about order and routine, but he never spoke about his military past. Instead, he simply said, "The habits you practice every day become the person you are tomorrow." Ethan noticed that even the inmates who usually avoided everyone else had started listening. Across the yard, Brandon Cole watched the scene in silence. He had spent years making sure people looked at him with fear, yet somehow the older inmate had earned respect without asking for it. One of Brandon's friends laughed and said the stories about Marcus had to be exaggerated, but Brandon did not answer, because he remembered the look in the old man's eyes during their first meeting in the cafeteria. There had never been fear there, only patience. Later that afternoon, Officer Walter Hayes walked into the storage room, carrying an old records folder he had requested from the prison archives. After Ethan showed him the faded magazine the night before, he had spent hours trying to confirm the memory that had been haunting him. While Marcus quietly repaired a damaged shelf, Hayes opened the folder and carefully examined several old newspaper articles attached inside. One black and white photograph showed a military training exercise from many years earlier. Standing at the center was a younger Marcus Reed wearing the insignia of an Army Ranger instructor, surrounded by men who would later become leaders themselves. Hayes slowly lowered the file and looked across the room at the older inmate. Everything finally made sense. The perfect organization, the calm under pressure, the discipline that never disappeared. Ethan quietly stepped beside the officer and whispered, "So it is true." Hayes nodded once and answered, "Some men spend their whole lives trying to become leaders. That man already was one long before he came here." Neither of them realized that another inmate, standing outside the open doorway, had overheard the conversation. The news spread through the housing block before evening count, but Marcus remained completely unaware. After dinner, he returned a misplaced book to the library shelf, helped an older inmate carry supplies back to his cell, and thanked a kitchen worker for an extra cup of coffee. Simple acts that seemed ordinary to him but extraordinary to everyone else. Brandon watched from the far end of the corridor as inmates quietly moved aside to let Marcus pass, not because they were afraid, but because they respected him. And for the first time since arriving at Greystone, Brandon began to wonder if he had completely misunderstood the quiet black inmate from the very beginning. While the lights dimmed and the prison settled into silence, Officer Walter Hayes closed the old records folder and looked one last time at the faded photograph, knowing that before long the truth about Marcus Reed would no longer remain a secret inside the walls of Greystone State Prison. By the beginning of the next week, almost everyone inside Greystone State Prison had heard the rumors about Marcus Reed, but the older inmate continued living exactly as he had on the day he arrived. He woke before sunrise, folded his blanket with perfect corners, straightened the small shelf inside his cell, and quietly waited for the doors to open. Ethan Walker noticed that the growing attention around Marcus seemed to have no effect on him at all. While other men would have enjoyed the admiration, Marcus treated every morning like another opportunity to practice discipline and respect. After breakfast, the inmates gathered in the recreation yard for their daily assignments. Marcus was asked to help organize equipment near the maintenance building, and as always, he accepted the task without complaint. Ethan worked beside him while several other inmates watched from a distance, curious about the man they had spent days talking about. Brandon Cole stood with his group near the basketball court, but unlike before, he no longer laughed when he looked toward Marcus. The certainty he once carried had slowly disappeared, replaced by quiet uncertainty. Officer Walter Hayes arrived a few minutes later carrying the old records folder under his arm. After spending another night reviewing military archives and newspaper clippings, he knew there was no longer any doubt about the truth. He walked directly toward Marcus, stopping only a few feet away. Ethan looked up nervously while the nearby inmates slowly grew silent. Hayes held the folder in his hands for a moment before speaking. "I have been trying to remember where I knew you from." Marcus looked at the older officer with the same calm expression he always carried, then gave a small respectful nod. Hayes opened the folder and revealed the faded newspaper photograph. The image showed a younger Marcus Reed standing proudly beside a group of Army Rangers after completing an elite instructor program. Several inmates nearby leaned forward, trying to see. Brandon unconsciously took a few steps closer. The old officer quietly continued, "Many years ago, I attended a joint emergency response exercise, and the man leading one of the training teams was you." Marcus looked down at the photograph for a second before answering softly, "That was a long time ago." Hayes smiled gently and replied, "Maybe for you. But some people never forget the men who taught them how to stay calm when everyone else was losing control." The entire yard remained silent. Ethan could hardly believe that the quiet inmate who spent his days organizing shelves and helping strangers had once trained some of the finest soldiers in the country. Brandon lowered his eyes, remembering the first day in the cafeteria and the way Marcus had simply wiped his shirt clean without showing anger. For the first time, he understood that the older man had never stayed quiet because he was weak. He had stayed quiet because he had already learned that real strength never needed to prove itself. One of the younger inmates finally asked Marcus why he had never told anyone about his military career. Marcus looked around the yard before answering. "The past is something you carry with you, not something you use to stand above other people." The words settled over the group with surprising weight. Even the correctional officers standing nearby listened carefully, because they understood that the lesson reached far beyond the prison walls. After the work assignment ended, Marcus quietly picked up a broom and began sweeping the walkway outside the maintenance building, as though nothing important had happened at all. Ethan rushed over to help him, while several other inmates joined. Without being asked, Brandon stood alone for a long moment watching the scene, then slowly walked forward. He bent down, picked up a small pile of scattered leaves, and placed them into the collection bin without saying a word. Marcus looked at him, offered the same simple nod he gave everyone else, and continued sweeping. While the afternoon sun settled across the yard, Officer Walter Hayes closed the old records folder and realized that the greatest lesson Marcus Reed had ever taught was not hidden inside military manuals or newspaper photographs. It was the quiet example of a man who carried extraordinary strength with complete humility, and that lesson was beginning to change the people around him one by one. A few days later, Greystone State Prison seemed different, not because the walls had changed or the routines had become easier, but because the people inside those walls had begun to see one another in a different way. The story of Marcus Reed had reached every housing block, every officer station, and every work crew, yet the older inmate continued living exactly as he always had. He woke before sunrise, folded his blanket with perfect corners, straightened the shelf inside his cell, and quietly prepared for another ordinary day. Ethan Walker stood in the corridor watching him and realized that the greatest surprise was not that Marcus had once been an elite Army Ranger instructor. It was that he never used that fact to demand respect from anyone. After breakfast, the inmates gathered in the recreation yard for their morning assignments. Marcus was once again asked to help organize equipment around the maintenance building, and as always he accepted without complaint. Several younger inmates now volunteered to work beside him, not because they had to, but because they had discovered that spending time around the older man somehow made the day feel easier. Marcus showed them simple ways to arrange supplies, carry tools without wasting energy, and solve small problems by staying calm instead of becoming frustrated. His lessons were never complicated, but they stayed with people long after the work was finished. Officer Walter Hayes watched from across the yard and quietly smiled, remembering the young Ranger instructor he had met decades earlier. The same calm eyes, the same steady voice, and the same belief that discipline was a gift meant to help others, not a weapon to stand above them. Across the yard, Brandon Cole stood alone for several moments before slowly walking toward Marcus. Conversations faded as inmates noticed what was happening. Ethan looked up from the toolbox he was organizing, unsure what to expect. Brandon stopped a few feet away and looked at the older inmate. The confidence that had once defined him was gone, replaced by honesty. He lowered his eyes and quietly said, "I judged you before I knew anything about you, and I was wrong." The yard became completely silent. Marcus looked at Brandon for a long moment, then placed the broom he was holding against the wall and answered in the same calm voice he had used since the day he arrived. "Every person makes mistakes. What matters is what they learn from them." Brandon nodded slowly. The weight he had been carrying seemed to disappear, and without another word he bent down and helped Ethan gather the last of the maintenance supplies. Several other inmates quietly joined them, and before long the entire work crew was cleaning the area together, not because anyone ordered them to, but because one man's example had changed the atmosphere around him. Later that afternoon, Ethan walked beside Marcus as they returned the equipment to storage. He finally asked the question that had been in his mind since finding the old magazine. "After everything you accomplished, why did you never tell anyone who you were?" Marcus looked through the open doorway toward the afternoon sunlight and smiled gently. "A title can earn attention, but character earns trust, and trust lasts much longer." Ethan carefully remembered every word because he knew he would carry that lesson long after leaving Greystone. As evening count approached, the inmates returned to their cells. Marcus folded his work gloves and placed them neatly on the shelf beside his bed. Officer Hayes completed his final patrol of the corridor and paused outside Marcus's cell for just a moment, giving the older inmate a respectful nod. Marcus returned it with the same quiet dignity he showed everyone else. Brandon looked across the block and offered a small nod of his own. Ethan closed his eyes and realized that the strongest man inside Greystone had never been the loudest or the most feared. He had simply been the one who understood that true strength was measured by patience, humility, and the ability to lift other people higher without ever asking for recognition. And as the lights faded across the prison that night, the story of Marcus Reed remained behind, not as the legend of an army ranger, but as the example of a man who proved that real greatness speaks softly and leaves the world better than it found it.